The orbital junkyard of Velix Station hung in the darkness of space like a forgotten cemetery, where old ships came to die and rust and be stripped of everything valuable until only their bones. Remaining Cathari woke before the station lights flickered. Because sleep never stayed with him for long, and his body had learned to survive on less than most beings needed. He was. Veloci and his blue scales had faded over the years from the bright azure of youth to a dull gray blue that spoke of too much work and too little hope, and not enough sunlight from any star. His hands were covered in calluses and small scars from decades of pulling apart dead machines, and his back ached from bending over engine cores that still held enough radiation to kill him slowly if he was not careful. But careful did not pay the bills, and so he took risks that wiser beings would refuse. The salvage yards of Velix Station were divided into tiers, and Cathari worked the lowest one where the ships were too damaged or too old or too dangerous for anyone else to bother with. He earned barely enough credits to afford his hapod, which was a metal box the size of a cargo container, where he slept on a thin mat and kept his few possessions hidden from thieves. The other workers on the lower tier were like him in many ways because they were all refugees from conquered worlds or descendants of broken peoples or simply unlucky souls who had fallen through the cracks of a galaxy that did not care about the weak Cathari had been born on a refugee station after his homeworld fell to the Dominion hegemony, and he had never seen the forests of Veloci Prime that his mother used to describe with tears in her eyes before she died. The hegemony had crushed his world 40 years ago and scattered his people across the stars like dust in the solar wind now. The Veloci worked as servants and laborers and salvage workers, while the hegemony grew fat on the resources of 100 conquered worlds. Cathari tried not to think about it too much because thinking led to anger, and anger led to foolish actions, and foolish actions led to death in the junkyard. He climbed out of his hapod and walked through the narrow corridors of the lower decks where the air recyclers hummed with the effort of keeping everyone alive and the walls dripped with condensation that smelled of rust and old oil. The other workers nodded at him as he passed because they all knew each other in the way that the poor and forgotten always do. There was Mork the Tefkai, who had lost his family in a hegemony raid and now spent his nights drinking cheap synth alcohol to forget. There was Sala, the old Morvani woman who had been a teacher on her homeworld before the invasion and now taught the station children to read in the few hours she was not working. There was Jex, the young hybrid who did not know what species his father had been and did not care to find out. They were all broken in their own ways, and they all kept moving because stopping meant dying. Cathari reached his workstation and began sorting through the pile of salvage that had been dumped there during the night cycle. Most of it was worthless junk, but sometimes he found components that he could repair and sell to the merchants who visited the station looking for cheap parts. His hands moved with the skill of long practice as he identified each piece and sorted them into piles. Engine components went into one bin and navigation systems went into another, and weapons parts went into a locked container because those were worth the most credits but also drew the most attention from station security. He worked in silence for several hours, and the familiar rhythm of the task allowed his mind to wander to places he usually kept locked away. He thought about his father. Veldon had been a tall Veloci with scales the color of deep ocean water and hands that could fix any machine ever built. Cathari remembered sitting on his father's lap as a young child and watching those hands move across engine schematics with a grace that seemed almost magical. His father had been a shipbuilder on Veloci Prime before the invasion, and he had been one of the best in the entire system. When the hegemony came, he had fought back with the others, and when the fighting was lost, he had fled with his family to the refugee stations. But Veldon had not stayed Keth or remembered the night his father left because it was burned in two. His memory like a brand on flesh. His mother had been crying, and his father had knelt down and pressed something into young Kithara's hands, it was a holograph projector small enough to fit in a child's palm. "Keep this safe for me," his father had said, and his voice had been steady, even though his eyes were wet with tears. "I have to go help some friends fight the darkness, but I will come back for you and your mother." He never came back. Years later, Kithara's mother told him the rumors she had heard from other refugees. She said that Veldon had joined a group of strange beings from the edge of the galaxy who were fighting against the hegemony. She said they called themselves humans, and they had ships unlike anything anyone had ever seen. She said they were probably just myths and stories that desperate people told themselves to keep hope alive. Kithara had believed her for most of his life. Humans were fairy tales, and his father was dead, and hope was a luxury that salvage workers could not afford. He kept the holograph hidden under his sleeping mat, and sometimes late at night when the station was quiet, he would activate it and look at the image it contained. The holograph showed his father standing beside a ship and smiling with pride. The ship was unlike anything in the junkyard or anywhere else Kithara had ever seen. It had angular lines and sharp edges, and it looked like it had been built by beings who expected to fight and survive and keep fighting no matter what. Kithara had never found another ship that looked like Ith was staring at a broken thruster assembly and thinking about his father when the alarms began to wail across the station. Emergency lights flickered to red, and the voice of the station master crackled over the speakers, demanding that all workers return to their quarters immediately. Kithara ignored the order and walked to the nearest viewport to see what was happening. A ship was dropping out of faster-than-light travel above the station, and it was trailing smoke from a dozen wounds in its hull. Station security vessels scrambled to intercept it, but they kept their distance because the ship was moving with purpose despite its damage, and ships that moved like that were dangerous. Kithara pressed his face against the cold glass of the viewport and stared at the approaching vessel. His heart stopped, his breath caught in his throat. The ship was angular and sharp and defiant, and it looked exactly like the one in his father's holograph. His hands began to shake as he watched it descend toward the station. "Impossible," he whispered to himself, but the evidence was right in front of his eyes. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice that sounded like his father said that maybe this fairy tales were true after all. The ship crashed into Docking Bay 7 with a sound like thunder that echoed through the entire station and made the old metal walls shake and groan. Kithara felt the impact through the floor beneath his feet, and he knew that whatever had just arrived was not going away quietly. Within minutes, the rumors began to spread through the lower decks like fire through dry grass. Some workers said it was a pirate vessel fleeing from hegemony patrols and looking for a place to hide. Others claimed it was a hegemony black ops ship on a secret mission that had gone wrong. A few whispered that it was something else entirely, but they would not say what because speaking certain words aloud could get you killed on a station where hegemony spies lurked in every shadow. Station Master Torvik appeared on every screen and speaker throughout the station, with his bloated face twisted into an expression of authority that fooled no one. He announced that Bay 7 was now under lockdown and that any worker found near the area would be arrested and sent to the hegemony labor colonies where troublemakers disappeared for. Knew he should listen to the warning because he had survived this long by keeping his head down and not asking questions, but he could not stop thinking about the ship. He could not stop seeing its angular silhouette against the stars and comparing it to the image burned into his memory from 1,000 nights of staring at his father's holograph. He waited until the night cycle when the station lights dimmed and most of the workers retreated to their pods to sleep or drink, or pretend that tomorrow would be better than today. Then he crept through the maintenance tunnels that wound through the station. Like veins through a body, he had learned these tunnels years ago, when he was young and foolish, and thought he might find a way to escape the station and make a new life somewhere better now. He used them to avoid the security patrols that Torvik had stationed throughout the main corridors. The tunnels were dark and cramped and filled with the smell of old lubricant and the skittering sounds of station vermin, but Cathari moved through them with the ease of long practice. He emerged from a maintenance hatch in the ceiling of Bay 7 and dropped silently to the floor behind a stack of cargo containers. The bay was lit by emergency lights that cast everything in shades of red and orange and made the shadows seem deeper and more threatening. Security guards stood at the main entrance, but they were facing outward toward the corridor, and they did not see Cathari slip between the containers and make his way toward the center of the bay. The ship was there up close. It was even more remarkable than he had imagined. The design was alien to everything he knew about spacecraft, and he had spent his entire life taking ships apart and learning their secrets. Hegemony vessels were built for intimidation with smooth curves and towering heights meant to make conquered peoples feel small and helpless. Ascended species ships were elegant and beautiful, with flowing lines that spoke of ancient civilizations who had mastered the stars long before the hegemony rose to power. This ship was neither of those things. It was angular and practical and covered in scars from weapons that had tried and failed to destroy it. Every wound in its hull had been patched with whatever materials were available, and the patches told stories of desperate repairs made in the middle of battle or on the edges of hostile space. This ship had been kept alive through sheer stubborn will, and Cathari felt something stir in his chest as he looked at it. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He walked around the vessel slowly and ran his hands along the hull, where the metal was still warm from re-entry. Cockpit section had been blown open by what looked like a direct hit from a plasma cannon, and Cathari climbed carefully through the gap and into the interior. The inside of the ship was dark, except for the flickering of damaged systems that were trying to stay online. Cathari activated the small light on his salvage tool and swept the beam across the cockpit. He saw control panels covered in symbols he did not recognize and seats designed for a body shape that was different from his own. And he saw the pilot. The being was slumped over the main console with one hand still resting on what looked like a navigation interface. It was unlike any species Cathari had ever encountered. Its skin was soft and bare, without scales or plates or exoskeleton, and it had a covering of dark fur on the top of its head that Cathari realized was probably hair. Its eyes were closed, and for a moment Cathari thought it was dead. Then the eyes opened. They were strange eyes that faced forward like a predator's, and they were dark brown and filled with pain, but also with something that looked like determination. The being looked at Cathari without fear or surprise, as if it had been expecting someone to come. "Can you fix her?" the being asked, and its voice was weak but steady. Cathari did not understand the words at first, but the translation implant in his ear caught up after a moment and rendered them into his own language. "The ship," the being continued, and its hand moved weakly across the console in a gesture that might have been affection. "She got me this far, and she deserves to fly again." Cathari stared at the being and then at the console beneath its hand. He recognized the layout not from any ship he had ever worked on, but from the schematics hidden in the data chip of his father's holograph. Had studied those schematics countless times as a child and tried to understand why his father had kept them and what they meant. Now, he was standing inside a ship that matched those schematics exactly. "My father flew one like this," he whispered, and the words came out before he could stop them. The being's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, and blood stained its teeth. "Then you are exactly who I was looking for," it said. Cathari felt the universe shift around him, as if everything he had believed about his life and his father and the nature of hope itself was being rewritten in a single moment. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Yara Chun," the being said, "and I am human." The word hung in the air between them like a promise or a threat, or maybe both. Human, the fairy tale species from the edge of the galaxy. The ones his mother said did not exist. The ones his father had left to join 40 years ago, they were real. Cathari looked at Yara Chun, and saw the blood soaking through her strange uniform and knew that she would die without help. He should leave her and pretend he had never come here and go back to his hat pod and forget that this night ever happened. That would be the safe thing to do. That would be the smart thing to do. Instead, he knelt beside her and began examining her wounds with the same careful attention he gave to damaged machinery. "I am going to help you," he said, and he was surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "And then you are going to tell me everything about my father." Yara-chan smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "He was a hero," she said, "and I think you might be one too." Kathari did not know if he believed her, but he knew that for the first time in 40 years, he felt something that might have been hope. Kathari worked through the night to stabilize Yara-chan's wounds using the emergency medical supplies he found scattered across the damaged cockpit. The human body was strange to him, with its soft skin and red blood, and bones that seemed too fragile to survive the violence that had clearly been done to it. But Yara-chan was tougher than she looked, and she stayed conscious through most of his work and talked to him in a voice that grew stronger as the hours passed. She told him things that changed everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. The humans were real, and they came from a small blue world on the very edge of explored space, where the stars grew thin and the darkness between them stretched for countless light years. When the Dominion hegemony first discovered them, they expected an easy conquest because the humans had only recently developed faster than light travel, and their technology was primitive compared to the ancient powers of the galaxy. They were wrong. The humans did not surrender when the hegemony fleet arrived in their system, and they did not bow when the hegemony demanded tribute and slaves. Instead, they fought back with a ferocity that shocked the ancient empire to its core. They built weapons from scraps and flew missions that should have been suicide, and refused to accept that they were supposed to lose. The war lasted decades, and hegemony threw more and more resources at the stubborn little species that would not die. And somewhere along the way, the humans realized something important. They were not the only ones who hated the hegemony. The galaxy was full of conquered peoples and broken civilizations and refugees who had lost everything to the same enemy. So the humans stopped fighting just for themselves and started fighting for everyone. They called it the Free Systems Alliance, and they welcomed anyone who wanted to resist the darkness. Veloci refugees joined them, and Tefkai survivors, and more Vani resistance fighters, and 100 other species who had been told they were defeated and who refused to believe it. Yara-chan paused in her story and reached into a compartment in her flight suit with trembling fingers. She pulled out something that made Kathari's heart stop. Was a jacket made of some kind of treated fabric with patches and insignia that he did not recognize, but he recognized the name stitched into the Calarval Dan. "Your father was one of the first Veloci to join us," Yara-chan said, and her voice was gentle. As she pressed the jacket into his hands, he flew beside human pilots in ships just like this one, and he was one of the bravest beings I ever knew. Kathari held the jacket and felt tears running down his scales for the first time since his mother's funeral. "What happened to him?" he asked Yara. Chen was quiet for a moment, and then she answered. "There was a hegemony attack on a refugee convoy 15 years ago, and the convoy was full of civilians, including children from a dozen different species. Your father volunteered to lead the defense squadron, even though we all knew it was a one-way mission. He held the line long enough for the convoy to escape, and then his ship was destroyed. He saved over 3,000 lives that day." Kathari pressed the jacket to his chest and breathed in the faint scent that still clung to it after all these years. It smelled like engine oil and old leather and something else that he could not identify, but that felt like home. "We kept the jacket for you," Yara-chan continued. "We always hoped we would find a way to return it to his family. I was carrying it when my mission went wrong, and I had to make an emergency jump to the nearest station. I do not believe in coincidences anymore. I think the universe wanted me to find you. Cathari looked at the human and saw that she was telling the truth, or at least she believed she was. He wanted to ask more questions about his father and about the Alliance and about the war that was still being fought somewhere out there in the darkness, but the sound of footsteps outside the bay interrupted him. Heavy footsteps and the crackle of hegemony communication devices. They found us, Yara Chen said, and her voice was suddenly sharp with urgency. Station Master Torvik must have sold us out. He works for the hegemony, and they pay him well to report anything unusual. Cathari knew she was right because everyone on the station knew that Torvik was corrupt, even if no one dared to say it out loud. The hegemony was coming, and they would take the human and the ship and probably kill Cathari just for being here. He should run, should escape through the maintenance tunnels and pretend this never happened and go back to his safe, miserable life in the salvage yards. But his father had not run. His father had flown toward danger to save strangers and die to harrow Cathari. Looked at the jacket in his hands and made a decision that changed the course of his life. Can the ship still fly? He asked. Yora-chan shook her head. The engines are damaged and the navigation system is offline. She needs at least a day of repairs before she can move. Then I will repair her, Cathari said, and his voice was steady now. I know these systems and I have access to parts from the salvage yard. I can make her fly again. Yara Chun stared at him for a long moment, and then she smiled. Your father used to say the same thing whenever we told him something was impossible. He would just nod and then do it anyway. Cathari felt something warm spread through his chest at those words. He carefully helped Yara Chun move to a hidden compartment in the back of the ship where she would be safe from the initial search. Then he slipped back out through the maintenance tunnels and began gathering the supplies he would need. He worked quickly and quietly and called in favors from other salvage workers who owed him for past kindnesses. By dawn, he had assembled a collection of parts and tools that would be enough to bring the ship back to life. He returned to Base 7 through the tunnels and found that the hegemony soldiers had completed their first sweep and moved on to search other areas of the station. They would be back, but for now he had time. He crawled inside the ship and began working with hands that seemed to know exactly what to do. The schematics from his father's holograph came alive in his memory and guided him through repairs that should have been beyond his skill. He understood now why his father had kept those schematics hidden in the data chip. They were not just memories. They were lessons waiting for the right moment to be taught. Hour by hour, the ship came back to life under his care systems flickered online, and damage was patched, and the great wounded vessel began to heal. Cathari was not just repairing a machine. He was reclaiming his inheritance. 3 hegemony warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Velix Station on the second day, and their massive silhouettes blocked out the stars like predators, circling wounded prey. Ari saw them through a crack in the bay doors, and felt fear twist in his stomach because he knew what those ships meant. The hegemony was not sending a search party anymore. They were sending an army. Station Master Torvik's voice echoed through every speaker on the station, announcing that all workers were to remain in their quarters during a mandatory security operation. He called it a routine inspection, but everyone knew the truth. The hegemony was hunting for something, and they would tear the station apart until they found it. Cathari kept working on the ship because stopping was not an option anymore. His hands moved across damaged systems with desperate speed, and his mind raced through calculations and possibilities. The ship was almost ready, but almost was not good enough. He needed more time and more parts and more hands to help with the repairs. The first visitor came that night. Morik the Tethkai appeared in the maintenance tunnel entrance with his 4 arms crossed and his compound eyes studying Cathari with an expression that might have been curiosity or concern. The whole station is talking about you, Morik said quietly. They say you are hiding something in Base 7. They say you are going to get yourself killed. Cathari did not stop working, but he nodded toward the ship behind him. I am fixing something that should not exist, he said. Something the hegemony wants to destroy. Something my father believed was worth dying for. Morik was silent for a long moment, and then he stepped into the bay and rolled up his sleeves. My family died because the hegemony decided our world was more valuable without us on it, he said. Tell me what you need. The second visitor came an hour later. Sala, the old Morvani woman, crawled through the maintenance tunnel with a bag of medical supplies and a look of fierce determination on her wrinkled face. I heard there is a wounded being in here, she said. I used to be a doctor before. I was a teacher, and before I was a salvage worker. Let me help. She found Yara Chun in the hidden compartment and began treating her wounds with a skill that decades of hard living had not diminished. Third and fourth visitors came together. Jex, the young hybrid, and 3 other workers from the lower decks who had heard the whispers and decided that they wanted to be part of something larger than their own survival. By midnight, there were 30 beings working on the ship. Veloci and Tethkai and Morvani, and others who had no names for their species anymore because the hegemony had erased their cultures along with their home world. She worked in shifts and shared tools and learned each other's languages through gesture and necessity. Kithri watched them and felt something he had not felt since he was a child. He felt like he belonged. Yara Chen was strong enough to sit up now, and she watched the work with wonder in her strange forward-facing eyes. This is what humans believe, she said to Cathari during a brief rest. We do not build ships that only we can fly. We build ships for everyone who wants to be free. Our technology is designed to be shared and learned and spread across the galaxy. That is why the hegemony fears us more than any weapon we have ever built. Because you cannot kill an idea that anyone can learn. Cathari understood then why his father had kept those schematics. Veldan had been passing down more than knowledge. He had been passing down hope. The hegemony soldiers came on the third day. They breached the main doors of Base 7 with plasma cutters and poured into the space with weapons raised and voices shouting commands. They expected to find a wounded fugitive hiding in a damaged ship. Instead, they found something that made them hesitate. 30 beings stood between them and the vessel workers and refugees and forgotten people who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for it. They held salvage tools and improvised weapons, and they did not flinch when the soldiers aimed their rifles. Cathari stood at the front of the group with his father's jacket hanging from his shoulders and his hands steady at his sides. Behind him, the ship hummed with power because they had finished the repairs just hours before. The engines were online and the navigation systems were working, and the vessel was ready to fly again. The hegemony commander was a tall being with sharp features and the cold eyes of someone who had ordered countless deaths without remorse. Surrender the human and the ship, he said in a voice that expected obedience. Do this, and you will be allowed to return to your work. Resist, and you will all be executed as enemies of the hegemony. Cathari looked at the commander and felt no fear. He had spent his entire life being afraid of the hegemony, and afraid of poverty and afraid of hoping for anything better. He was done being afraid. My father flew one like this, he said quietly, and his voice carried across the silent bay. And so will I. He turned and walked toward his ship, and the other workers parted to let him through. The commander shouted an order, and weapons began to fire. But the workers had prepared for this moment. They scattered and took cover and returned fire with the salvage tools they had modified into weapons. Morik charged the nearest soldiers with all 4 arms swinging and bought precious seconds with his Fury Sala, triggered an emergency decompression alert that sent blast doors slamming down throughout the bay and cut off reinforcements. Jax and the others held the line with desperate courage while Cathari climbed into the cockpit. Yara Chun was already strapped into the co-pilot seat, and her hands were moving across the navigation console. Do you know how to fly this? She asked. Cathari settled into the pilot seat and felt the controls under his hands. They felt familiar, even though he had never touched them before. They felt right. "I think I was born knowing how to fly this," he said. The engines roared to life, and the ship lifted from the deck. Cathari opened the rear hatch and shouted for the others to board. They came running through the chaos of weapons fire and screaming and smoke. Every single one of them made it inside before the hatch closed. Bay doors were sealed, but that did not matter. Cathari aimed the ship at the weakest section of the station hull and pushed the throttle forward. They burst through the metal like a fist through paper and exploded into open space with debris trailing behind. Them hegemony interceptors were already launching from the warships, but Cathari did not hesitate, pointed the ship toward the stars, and flew. "Hold on," he said to his crew. "We are going somewhere the hegemony cannot follow." The ship jumped to faster-than-light speed and left Velix Station behind. Forever. The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel into a nebula that burned with the colors of a dying sunset, and Cathari felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight before him. Ships. Hundreds of ships. They filled the nebula like a fleet of stars, and each one carried the angular silhouette that he had come to know as the mark of human design. But the vessels were not crewed only by humans. As the ship drew closer, Cathari could see through the viewports of passing craft, and he saw faces that made his heart swell with emotion. There were Veloci with blue scales like his own, piloting fighters with casual skill. There were Tefkai manning weapon stations with their forearms moving in perfect coordination. There were Morvani and Zelith and Corvin and species he had never seen before, all working together in ships that had been built to be shared. This was the Free Systems Alliance. This was what his father had died protecting. This was real. Yara Chun guided them toward a massive station hidden in the heart of the nebula and spoke into the communication system with codes that opened docking bay doors. "Welcome to Haven," she said with a tired smile. "This is the heart of the resistance. This is where freedom is built." They landed in a bay that was bigger than the entire lower deck of Velix Station, and medical teams rushed to meet them with stretchers and equipment. Yara Chan was taken to the medical wing, despite her protest that she was fine, and the other workers from Velix Station were led to quarters where they could rest and recover from their ordeal. But Cathari was asked to wait. A delegation was coming to meet him. They arrived an hour later. 3 beings walked toward him across the gleaming floor of the docking bay, and Cathari felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. The first was a human male with gray hair and the bearing of a military commander who had seen too many battles and lost too many friends. The second was a Veloci female with scales the color of storm clouds and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and authority. The third was a Tethkai elder with ceremonial markings on his carapace that spoke of high rank and great respect. "You are Veldon's son," the human said, "and it was not a question. We have been waiting for you for a very long time." The Veloci female stepped forward and touched Cathari's face with gentle fingers. "You look just like him," she said, and there were tears in her eyes. "I flew beside your father in the liberation of Corvin Prime. He spoke of you often, and he always believed that one day you would find your way here." Cathari did not know what to say, so he simply stood there and let the moment wash over him like a wave. The Tethkai elder gestured toward the ship that had carried them to Haven. "This vessel has served the Alliance for 40 years, he said. "It has been flown by heroes from a dozen species, and it has survived battles that should have destroyed it 100 times over. But it has been without a permanent pilot since your father's death. It has been waiting for someone worthy." Cathari looked at the ship and remembered the way the controls had felt under his hands. He remembered the way the systems had responded to his touch as if they recognized him. He remembered his father's schematics and his father's jacket and his father's sacrifice. "What happens now?" he asked. The human commander smiled and handed him a small insignia that gleamed in the light of the nebula. Now you become what your father always knew you could be, he said. A pilot of the Free Systems Alliance, a defender of the liberated, a light in the darkness that the hegemony cannot extinguish. Cathari took the insignia and pinned it to his father's jacket. He turned to look at his crew, the workers from Velix Station had gathered behind him without him noticing, and they watched him with eyes full of hope and loyal. Timorik stood at the front with his forearms crossed and a fierce grin on his face. Saw smiled with the quiet pride of a teacher watching his students surpass her expectations. Jax nodded with respect that went beyond words. They were not salvage workers anymore. They were crew, they were family. The human commander looked at the ragged group of refugees and saw something that made him nod with approval. It seems you have already found your squadron, he said. That is good, because we have a mission that requires volunteers. He activated a holographic display that showed a world surrounded by hegemony warships. This is Tethran 4, he explained. It is a slave world where the hegemony works millions of beings to death in their mining operations. We have been planning a liberation for years, but we have never had enough ships or pilots to attempt it. Until now. He looked at Cathari with eyes that held both hope and challenge. Will you lead the volunteer squadron? Cathari thought about his life on Velix Station. He thought about the fear and the poverty and the hopelessness that had defined his existence for so long. Then he thought about his father standing beside his ship and smiling with pride. He thought about what it meant to inherit not just a jacket or a set of schematics, but a purpose. We will, he said, and his voice rang across the bay with a certainty that surprised even him. We have a promise to keep. He climbed into the cockpit of the ship that his father had once flown, and his crew took their stations. Around him, the navigation console lit up with the coordinates for Tethran 4, and the engines hummed with readiness through the viewport. Cathari could see other ships forming up around them as word spread through the alliance that the volunteer squadron was launching Veloci and humans and Tethkai and Morvani and countless others who had chosen to fight. Instead of surrender, they were all flying ships with angular silhouettes and shared designs. They were all inheriting the same dream. Cathari placed his hand on the throttle and felt his father's presence beside him like a warmth that had never truly faded. My father flew one like this, he said quietly to himself. Then he pushed the throttle forward and led his squadron into the light. Behind him, 1,000 inherited wings followed, and somewhere in the darkness, the hegemony trembled. Because they had tried to crush hope and failed. They had tried to break the spirit of defiance and failed. And now that spirit was spreading from world to world and ship to ship and heart to heart, not because humans had forced it upon the galaxy, but because they had shared it freely with anyone brave enough to reach out and take it. The universe was changing, and Cathari was proud to be part of the change his father would have been proud too.